Please believe what we are telling you. The drones attack.
Breaking Bread, Conversations in Black Studies is a conversation series hosted by the Black Africana Studies Department at Cerritos College. The discussions in this conversation series seek to problematize, investigate, and unpack the foundational issues that impact, be it positive or negative, the life experiences of the African diaspora. These conversations are handled with love and care, situating a designated safe space that allows for and encourages dialogues and frameworks that promote African unity, liberty, and empowerment. Breaking Bread also seeks to close the gap between the educator, student body, and surrounding community, engaging in the type of Black study that moves beyond the classroom, engaging life experiences wherever they are found. Dr. Natalie Sarton is an assistant professor in the English department and chair of the Black Africana Studies Department at Cerritos College. She completed her doctoral work in educational leadership at California State University Fullerton. For her dissertation, titled Lifting as We Climb, The Relevance of the Critical Methods and Approaches of the Late 19th Century Black Women Activists to Educators Today, she offered a critical examination of the possible contributions that 19th century activists Anna Julia Cooper and Frances Harper can make to the pedagogical model of teaching African American students. Her research interests include cultural theories and pedagogies, African American and other ethnic literature, and African-centered research methodologies. Clayton Coleman is the Associate Director of Instructional Design for Penn Arts and Sciences Online Learning. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts in English and Political Science from Rutgers University and holds a Ph.D. in English from the University of Delaware. His work lives at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, science fiction, and digital studies, as he examines technology's impact on community-building efforts for Black folks and other minoritized groups in digital environments. He has presented and published scholarship on Black speculative futures in literature, music, and critical digital pedagogy. In addition to his instructional design and curriculum development work at the University of Pennsylvania, he teaches courses on digital strategies and culture. He also teaches courses on Black speculative futures and design justice at Claremont Graduate University. So we have two profound conversationalists today. We'll be discussing some profound work that of Octavia Butler, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to take away. I'm very excited for this discussion. The work of Octavia Butler is some of my favorite conversation pieces. She, by far, I say her and Baldwin are probably my favorite writers. If you could look, they sit over my shoulders, so they're always kind of watching and looming over me. So let's get into it. I would like to start with you, Dr. Sarton, if that's okay. How does the work of Octavia Butler inform the work that you do in the classroom or the pedagogical work that you engage?
Excellent. And thank you, Professor Manzili. Thank you for facilitating the Breaking Bread discussions. I'm happy to be here and happy to be invited to take part in this one. The way in which Butler's work informs my work is, well, first, Butler herself, in terms of, just her own scholarship, her attention to detail in the novel, her, just herself being a researcher, right, and including that in her novels. I think that that's admirable in itself. But specifically, I think here I'm speaking of, all of her work, but certainly the Parable series. There Butler encourages just lifelong learning. In a sense, Lauren Alamina is, at the core of all that she's able to do. It's because of what she's learned and her commitment to reading and learning and gaining knowledge in order for her to do the things that she eventually, will have to do. Let's see. I think Butler also encourages us to expand beyond the present. And think beyond. Again, the whole concept of earth seed is, again, for us to scatter in ways that, she describes that, seeds are typically scattered, but to scatter and find new ways to discover new possibilities. And so therefore, in terms of my own pedagogical practice, I like to think that I encourage students to, again, and the work that I incorporate, the readings that are incorporated in and curriculum and things encourage students to think beyond the present, to think about the future, right? And also, the part that they play. And so to some degree, it's to inspire students, and it's what Butler's work does for us. Yeah.
Thank you for that beautiful offering. Dr. Coleman, how about you? How does the work of Butler engage your pedagogy?
Thank you for that question. And also, I want to echo Dr. Sarton's word of thanks for creating this space. It is a profound thing to be able to talk about Butler's work, and to do it in such good company is a pleasure and a privilege. So I appreciate it a lot. In terms of the ways that Butler's work has informed my teaching, I love the way that Dr. Sarton framed this idea of lifelong learning. I think for me, it's a similar type of process, right? Where we see in representations of Lauren Alamina's journey through different communities and working towards forms of connection between people who might not necessarily agree or have the same life experiences. I think that she kind of practices and models that work for us through, as Dr. Sarton mentioned, that deep study. And I think that form of deep study takes many facets, right, in her work. And it shows up in the ways that she builds thick characters, right? She centers Black women. She centers people who are often on the margins of society. Sometimes they're young, sometimes they're ignored. And she takes them and puts them in the center of the conversation to help and allow people to kind of build that process of connection that isn't hierarchical in the same way that you see in other learning spaces or representations of learning spaces. So for me, in terms of my pedagogy, I try to model those things as well that I learned from her. And also, she's one of the first science fiction novelists that I read. And I learned that through her work, that there was a such thing as Black science fiction in the first place, right? And that it didn't necessarily have to involve white men. And it didn't have to involve like these static representations of gender and static representations of power dynamics that I didn't want to replicate in the classroom once I realized that that was a thing that I wanted to do. So I think that that is one of the ways that, well, one of the many ways that she has influenced my pedagogical process and the way to understand teaching and learning.
Yeah, that's really dope. And I really love how you kind of situate the textuality of her characters, right? Especially individuals like Lauren thinking about the parable series, and then Anyanwu thinking about the Patternist series. Also for me, I often see Octavia Butler kind of writing herself into the protagonist, right? And as you mentioned, Dr. Sarton, Lauren being a lifelong educator, thinking about even texts like Kindred, right? The main character is a writer herself. Thinking of texts like Book of Martha, the main character is a writer. So Butler has a way of kind of infusing herself into the protagonist work that she does. And you also mentioned, right, like beyond these static notions of who could play the hero, involving women protagonists, and involving characters who as you mentioned, are typically placed in the margins. So how does this recentering, if you will, on the people who could do dynamic work, how is that instructive for you as an educator? Dr. Sarton?
Excellent. Certainly to this point, or the point, maybe the initial point, because I want to respond to so much you just said, but in terms of Butler infusing herself as into her work, and these characters being educators and writers, one thing that comes to mind in the Parable series is Lauren Alamina being both an educator and also a writer, and actually how Earthseed comes to life through her writing, and how when we think about the writing process, remember she says, it's nothing that I discovered.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing that I created. It was always there, but it really comes to life through the journaling. And obviously, if the novel itself is written as a journal, which I think is beautiful, and also how she struggles with that. Remember, she'll go back and revise, and so there's a writing process that's happening, that's unfolding. But in the end, what comes from it is there's something that's developed from that. And so I tend to think that Butler is giving a nod to, again, the importance of writing, the importance of expression, self-expression in that way as a way of creating. Yeah.
Yes, really good. Dr. Coleman, how about you? How do you see the work of, Butler involving herself in the work? How does that inform your work?
Yeah. I would definitely agree with the idea of writing. And I think that no word is spared in her writing, right? Everything is intentional. And she talks about this being a slow writer, being someone who takes a lot of time to kind of work through her process, and having to navigate different experiences. I know in the beginning when she first started writing, she was also working full time, and she had to find different spaces to insert that writerly process. And I could see in the text, particularly Parable, where Lauren Alamina says she doesn't necessarily want to be a leader. It's kind of foisted upon her after her father has a situation with her father. And after teaching the children how to do things that she learns, that she actually builds into her Earthsea practice. So I think that that is one of the ways that it informs my understanding of what it can mean to center people who don't necessarily want to take up space in the same way that other folk take up space. And also are cognizant of how people exist within a larger community too. Because I think that having that intention and having that kind of perception to understand how people enter into different social environments allows her to adapt in ways that are really helpful, and also makes it so that her Earthsea verses actually represent the diversity of people who might exist within a social community. And I think that that's really important too. And I think that I know that there are conversations that happen within the text that talk about what it means to be in this position of like a liminal position where you don't always have the most power in a particular place. And you might be seen as someone who can be gotten over on. So being scrappy enough to be able to do things that will allow you to survive, and also that you can kind of share resources with your community too, is something that I've learned as well.
If we could stay with that, Dr. Coleman, because what it invokes in my mind was Lauren's hyper empathy, right? And how that plays a role in her ability to survive, in her leadership qualities, right? Because she's hyper empathetic, she's always attentive to other people's needs, and that really comes to play in her non-hierarchical leadership models. How does that come to play for you?
Yeah. So I think how it comes to play is the version of care work that I build into classroom spaces. And I think that it can be a real challenge, because we see with Lauren's empathy work, it can layer flat in some ways. And some people can confuse it too. They can kind of take advantage of that. And that's one of the things that she has to hide and only share it with people who she trusts. And that gets me thinking about how we build sustainable care practices in an educational environment that are built on trust. And that also acknowledges the fact that it can be really challenging and really difficult to show up as your full self and to sometimes get hurt in the process. And what that means to kind of build systems that acknowledges the potential for that to happen, while also acknowledging too that makes room for us to get into places that we might not otherwise, that we might feel too afraid and too kind of disconnected from the reality of the situation in order to do. So I think that that's important. That's one of the ways that hyper empathy informs my pedagogy. And it also gets me thinking, not only from my perspective, but also from other folk who are in the environment, like what types of experiences might they have had that can shape our understanding of what care looks like. Because it might look like something for me that is different from other folk, and being open to that difference can be really helpful and generative.
Yeah. And Dr. Sarton, how about you? How do you see hyper empathy, or how Dr. Coleman's situations, the practice of care, how does that infuse your work?
Yeah, and I really like to what Dr. Coleman said. I can relate, and just to add to, I've, with some in the room before, I've shared, or I've talked about Bell Hooks, her pedagogical practice of engaged pedagogy. Yeah. And that idea is particularly in a classroom setting, it requires a level of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. You reach this level, you reach this sort of sense in the class, or I guess the goal of it is to reach this place in a class where you can't really, the lines are blurred between learning and what you experience and what you feel inside, because it's just, and this is again across, in a classroom setting, but it requires vulnerability. And so I think about hyper empathy, and I think about Lauren and the way in which, when she lived inside the wall, there wasn't opportunities to be vulnerable in that way, because remember, her father, her family, they tried to hide, or the goal was to, they encouraged her to hide for many reasons, but really there was a lack of trust within the community. But when Lauren, when she stepped outside the wall and created her own community, she created a sense of trust, right? And she was able to, and also too, she was closer in proximity. Even though obviously the neighborhood, they were very close, but outside the wall, they were closer in proximity. They had to move together as one. And so I think it allowed her to be vulnerable and share, and all of them to share things with one another. And so you see relationships that are stronger, that are deeper than the ones that existed inside the wall, even though they had the cover of the wall. Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
I really like how you took that, and I think that's a great segue to what I kind of want to get into next. How does Earthseed for you, Butler's manipulation of Earthseed, how does that kind of problematize static notions of religion? How does it speak to the work that spirituality could do as an emancipatory force? What is your take on that, Dr. Sarton?
Yeah, this is a good question too. And, I think the way that Lauren, her critique on not Lauren's, but Butler's critique on religion, particularly Lauren's, what's called her father's religion, which is a form of Christianity. Um, Again, it's Butler's is showing it or illustrating it in its limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think Earthseed, well, first of all, I think it's a religion that Lauren created to in order to live, in order to evolve in the world that is. And so, and it seems again that her father's religion, it's limiting in terms of in its ability. She talks about it's not good enough to just survive. Because again, if we survive, and also in terms of I know we'll get into maybe mobility a little later, but this idea of mobility, they're just sitting there,
Yeah.
in this community, and they're just surviving. They're not thriving. And so Earthseed allows, this whole, a new ideology, a new way of thinking allows her to not only survive, but to thrive, right? This idea of spreading seed and not worrying, right? She talks about seed spread, and they're not really responsible for how they spread.
Right.
They can spread by animal, by wind, by water. But again, just even, seeing yourself as what am I trying to say? Just again, the idea of believing something beyond, right? Of looking forward, like a forward-looking sort of way of approaching the world. I think Earthseed gives all of them that, which allows them to live beyond the devastation of Robledo. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it sustains them throughout the whole novel, right? Like when you go through things like Christian Camp America, I believe it was called, right? It was the hope of Earthseed that kind of allowed them to maintain through that. Dr. Coleman, how about for you? How do you see, Butler's problematization of religion or the possibilities of things like Earthseed?
Yeah. So first, I want to take a step back because I love that framing of survival and like that stasis and vulnerability and thriving, because I think that's really important. I love the way that you framed that, Dr. Sarton. I think that the idea that in order to thrive, in order to change, in order to adapt, you have to find some form of vulnerability. And I think that is one of the things that separates Earthseed from Lauren's father's religion in some ways, right? The fact is that they did not want to be vulnerable. Part of the wall was a representation of that kind of lack of that desire to be vulnerable. And what happens was that, it got knocked down in a lot of ways, right? And through Lauren's religion, because she's more open to vulnerability, more open to adaptivity, she can kind of adjust to the circumstances. She can kind of understand the world as it is and look forward to the world as it might be, as opposed to sticking to the world as it is and looking back to the way it was, right? And trying to get back to that point. And I think understanding that what gives Lauren and this construction of religion that she creates some legs for, and you were talking about mobility in a lot of ways, the legs to move to a place that's more sustainable. Because I think in the absence of vulnerability, in that stasis, what we don't do is think about the future in some ways, right? And that idea of sustainability, that narrative of what can we hold on to, what can we keep, and what do we need to let go of, doesn't necessarily get as much space and room as it needs to in order for us to exist in sustainable community with each other. So I think that is one of the lessons that I've gotten from the construction of Earthseed, but also the fact that she locates God within all of us, and also has the idea that it is deeply connected and entrenched in methods of change, and giving each of us the power to realize that change in mutual relation, interdependent relation with other folk. And I think that's important too.
You both phrased it as her father's religion, and then it eventually becomes her brother's religion, and Butler further complicates those dynamics in the discourse within her brother and her. But if we could kind of stick with the father a little bit, because for me, the father serves as a looming presence throughout the text. And if I think about how we started in this conversation was tapping into spirit and honoring ancestors. And for me, that's kind of the work, or that's the presence that Lauren's father has, is like that ancestral veneration, but also that ancestral guide to kind of give her the inspiration and the insight to maintain these very terrible circumstances. So what was the work that Baba Olamina does for you within the text, Dr. Sarton?
This is a good question, and of course, he's a favorite character. You can't help but you become attached to him because he's a good person.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of parallels, and I'm sure all of us do, between Lauren and her father, Reverend Olamina.
Yep.
And for one, Reverend Olamina is a spiritual leader, and so is Lauren. And just in terms of the way that, from the start of the novel, Lauren says, my father and I share a birthday, and then we know later, Lauren and her daughter, there's a lot going on there, but yeah, I think Reverend Olamina, I think his leadership style there's some strength in that leadership style too, but also obviously Lauren employs this different leadership style, and that's effective too. She still has great regard and respect for her father, even though she, doesn't share in terms of his religious ideology. But still, she, I still think he, his influence is always there, again, because of who he is and their relationship. They have a really special relationship. But I do think, and again, I don't, did you say you talked a little bit about leadership, or you want me to go into?
Whichever you feel comfortable, you do the leadership.
Okay.
You talk about,
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought her leadership style, the way it differed from Reverend Olamina's, is he was great too, right? He was the rock of the community, but when he fell, the community fell. Yeah. And Lauren, what she did was she, for the most part, first she built relationships with everyone in the community, and it could have been just in terms of the way in which they had to move together. Mm-hmm. They were much closer proximity, but she allowed people to move on their strengths, you know what I mean? And so they understood her as a leader, but it was much more collective in terms of the decision making, and so they had input. Whereas Reverend Olamina, he was just a different kind of leader, and I think if he had cultivated others to be strong as well, I mean, in terms of a leadership, he did, but in terms of this way, maybe the community wouldn't have fallen so soon, maybe in that way, but yeah, I think so. Again, I just think she sort of observed and crafted her own leadership skills. But again, it was based off of her father. She still carried a lot of characteristics as he did. He had integrity. He was a good person. He cared about the community, the safety. And again, yeah, I think back, Dr. Coleman, to our conversation about his main goal was to keep them safe in that place. Whereas Lauren, was there, she moved beyond that community. So, which in the end was good. Yeah.
Necessary. Absolutely. Dr. Coleman, for you, how do you see the work or the presence of Baba Olamina?
Yeah, and I love the way that we have this idea of different forms of leadership, and they can be equally important. I think it's really significant to say that these are leaders for specific spaces and times. And leaders can always adapt, of course, but it's important to know that each of the leadership styles have forms of context. He was a great leader for a time that existed until a certain point, right? And I think I love the idea of him being a rock, and I think of him being deeply rooted too, right? But I think part of the problem is, like you were saying, Dr. Sarton, he didn't necessarily spread the seeds in the way that would be helpful for the community to grow. And I do think of course, this idea of Sankofa, right? Like looking back while moving forward. And I think that part of it was that he got the looking back part right? Like giving the idea of working through all of the different systems and histories and connections to all of the knowledge that was helpful for Lauren as she kind of exited outside of that space, but not necessarily the looking forward, right? And I do remember like the time when the outside folk came in and, Lauren tried to get people to prepare and didn't want to scare people, right? But the idea is that, sometimes the reality of the future is scary. And sometimes it does take difficult decisions that will get people in fractured states. But leaders for the moment can adjust to those moments, as opposed to feeling like they need to always be the rock. Because as you said, Dr. Sarton, that will lead to a community falling if everyone's only dependent on that person. And that leads to, I think, conversations about decentralized leadership that I think is important to acknowledge as well, as we talk about the work that Butler does, because that proliferates throughout much of her work, right? Where she has this idea of mutualism and interdependence and non-hierarchical relationships that are focused on decentralized leadership that we see in other movements now and have happened in history as well, as being ones that we replicate and that has lives that last and live on, even when folk try to target a specific person within that leadership structure.
Yeah, and for me, I see it as more of like a cross-generational discourse, right? And this idea of picking up where the previous generation left off, right? And Baba Olamina, he lays that groundwork and that foundation, and then Lauren's able to kind of take that groundwork and that foundation and birth it into a whole different dimension. And I think really, from a very practical standpoint, right, as a people, that's how we should move, right? We should be able to kind of piggyback on the work of those who came before us. And I see, Butler writing that within the text. If we can still stay with the parables, but I want to kind of interject the Patternist series as well, and look at the two protagonists and the work that Butler does within Olamina and within Ayanwu, and like really exploding these static notions of what the woman's body could do, the binary understandings of the woman's body. And she really just offers this really dynamic and expansive interpretation of the woman's body. How is that instructive for you, Dr. Sarton?
This is a good question. And, and this is an important question as well. And okay, I'm going to stick with Lauren, and I know Dr. Coleman, I can't wait to hear what you your thoughts on the Patternist series. So certainly, Lauren does not yield to those societal pressures that are almost imposed on her. Not only just by the community that she lives, but I remember there was a conversation with her brother Keith. One of the last times he had come back to the community, he said, "You should just marry Curtis and have children." And all that she see, the women, young women within the community, one, preparing a wedding dress. I mean, again, preparing for a life that Lauren feels, wait a minute, there's another reality happening. And this doesn't match what's happening on the outside. It's not safe. And so I think Lauren, she right away knows that's not what she wants for herself. And she's not afraid to voice, this is not what I want for me. I remember early on in the novel, she was going to leave by herself, which again is another form of not needing the protection of men or the community, which in the end, we're happy she didn't leave alone, right? Because we know that part of her ability to survive was because of others, the relationships, and her, having that community. But still, the fact that she was going to leave on her own and she was preparing for herself, she was preparing the best that she could to survive on her own. And then also, Lauren understands the dynamics in terms of the power dynamics between male, female, and therefore decides to go, at some point to disguise herself as a male, which I believe, the way I read the novel, it's for no other reason but protection, right? As a form of protecting yourself from not seeming vulnerable. And then one last thing I want to say too, I think her ability, she goes against all these, again, social norms, even the ability to choose a partner later, Bankole, she, again, which defies, what some might believe in terms of age and, but she chooses for herself, so she does these things again, and she's not, coerced to do things because of society's expectations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, very well said. Thank you. Dr. Coleman, how about you? How does the Butler's, problematization of static notions of women's body become instructive?
Yeah, that idea of choice gets real complicated in the Patternist series for Anyanwu. And I've always said that, like, and I've said this to a couple of people, like, I dream of being Anyanwu. Like when I first read that, this is my jam. I would love to be this person. But like, for all the type of malleability and representations of gender and performing our understandings of sexuality and all the rest, she doesn't necessarily have the same type of choice and agency because of her relationship to Doro in that text. And I think it's a really stark contrast to Lauren in some ways, right? Like, so Anyanwu can change her body, she can change into the animal, she can change her shape and everything like that, but she's still bound by that relationship to the seed villages that happen in that Doro's domain in some ways. And throughout the novel, she's fighting up against that. But I think that one of the ways that Butler gives us kind of out of that is to show that she can escape if she changes her body, if she changes into something that doesn't have to fall within the binaries of male, female, or even human, non-human in some ways, because she gets to be a dolphin. She loves being a dolphin. She loves being in the water and having relationships with other animals, other sentient beings, and gets us to think differently about how we construct humanity as this kind of, getting back to that conversation about protection, as this protected category that's divorced from nature, when it isn't. It is something that's in conversation with the world around us and the natural world. And I think that that is one of the many things that her representation of bodily fluidity gave to me through Anyanwu's presence in the text.
Yeah, thank you. You know, what I would like to kind of engage, if we could kind of talk about two things. One, you know, the mobility and the migration within not only Earthseed, within the Parable series, but also the Patternist series. Then also thinking about the Patternist series and thinking about the immortality of Doro and the immortality of Anyanwu. How does Butler engage that or employ that to kind of disturb these linear understandings of time? You know, and whichever you feel, you know, inclined to answer, feel free.
Would you like me to answer?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Starr, you can start. Yeah, absolutely.
No worries. Okay, this is good. Okay, again, in terms of Butler, I think Lauren always had her sights on beyond from the start, right? She's hanging laundry with her stepmother and she's looking at the stars. And while her stepmother is thinking, I want to return, you know, he's like, I want to return to what things were. And she's like, no, I want to go there. You know, she's fascinated with this astronaut. And again, she's not concerned. The whole idea of Earthseed is it's not a matter of how I'm going to get there. It's about having the desire, you know, to scatter. And so I feel I don't know, a part of her otherworldly again, and always her sights were set on things outside of the world, beyond, you know, this world that we live in. And then, you know, I was once in a discussion where Lauren was compared to Harriet Tubman in terms of her, even in terms of something that, you know, first in terms of gaining the knowledge, you know, the way in which Tubman too learned how to live, you know, or how to survive, right, outside of, I mean, in terms of as she fled from the south to the north, and Lauren doing the same thing. Lauren learned a lot of things, learned how to survive and prepared herself well. And then also the way in which she, you know, Lauren herself as a guide, you know, guiding people north. And then also there's a spiritual component to that too, you know, that we see inside of Lauren. And also, you know, that we, in terms of our analysis of Harriet Tubman as well. So that's just some thoughts.
I like especially the Harriet Tubman, because even the way that like physically that Lauren is described kind of embodies Harriet Tubman, even like the how she's kind of broad and you know, there's a physicality to her. And you think about a lot of the stories of Harriet Tubman and the physical altercations that she would get into is very likened to what Lauren, how she lives her life. So that's a really brilliant and profound connection being made. Dr. Coleman, how about you?
Yeah, I like that connection to Harriet Tubman as well. And I think about, so the question about immortality and how time kind of connects and how we see it differently through the text. I think of the connection between this idea of the seed, right? This thing that grows over time that we may not necessarily ever see. We may not live to see it come to full fruition, right? When it comes to trees, like I love nature and trees, and I plant trees around the city and stuff like that. And some of the trees, I will never see them as adults because of how long they live. But I do know that it is a way of looking at time as something that could be, that something that will be. And I like Dr. Sarton when you were talking about looking up at the stars, because I know that that is part of the goal of Earthseed, right? To spread ourselves among the stars. And star time and light time is different from our time in a lot of ways too. Millions, billions of years, as opposed to the short, relatively minuscule idea of how we understand time on this planet too. So it forces us to kind of expand our understanding of our existence here, and also our relationship to other beings, whether sentient or not, that exist for longer periods of time. But when we get specifically to Doro and Anyanwu, I see like the proliferation of their communities as an extension of themselves too. And so we see it over time, them trying to work for someone who won't die, someone who could be immortal just like them. And while they were doing it through their bodies, through biological means, I think that Lauren was doing it through spiritual means, through Earthseed, right? Like, so this thing will survive after me. It'll adapt. It'll be something that people can use and not necessarily see me through, but see the types of goals that I had for a humanity that was loving, that was caring, that was fecund, as you say, that was adaptable, and that allows us to connect to a world and to each other in ways that weren't exploitative like we've done in the past. And I see that in Anyanwu's relationship, not so much in Doro's, because he's another conversation, but Anyanwu's relationship, the community that she wanted to build, I see that too.
You know, I love the way you articulated, you know, Earthseed, and another way to think about Earthseed is really is Lauren's work, or just her life work, and it's going to live on beyond her. In fact, she's witnessing the ship leave for the stars, but she wasn't on the ship to go to the stars, right? So that kind of embodies what you're speaking about. But the last question I would have for both of you, and I think it's a really profound question. One, what character in the Parable series or in the Patternist series do you identify with most? And then two, how does, thinking about this notion of Earthseed being Lauren's life work, you know, what is your life work and how do you engage and participate in your life practice? You can start with Dr. Sarton if you...
These are two good questions. Okay, I would say certainly my highest self, I identify with Lauren, you know, and I hope we all do.
Right.
Because again, she's just driven.
Yeah.
She's very careful. She prepares. She seeks knowledge, right? She's organized, and then she carries out a plan. She sees it through. And so, yeah, my highest self. But you know, to be honest, I can see some of the other characters when there's fear, when there's doubt. You know, I understand how that happens, and I like to, as we get to Parable of the Talents, right? We see these other characters evolve. You know, they expand beyond, you know, they perhaps if Lauren, her progression, we saw that in Parable of the Sower.
Yeah.
But, you know, later we see, you know, other characters that they really evolve too, you know, and they come into a higher sense of who they are. And that's beautiful to see too. In regard to Lauren's life work, certainly Earthseed, you know, and you and I, we got a chance to talk to, and Earthseed did become her practice, you know, and so, which was also beautiful to see. She herself, you know, seeds herself, you know, and look what she was able to create, you know, and we see, you know, even the very start of Parable of the Talents, we see what she was able to create through that. But even the end of, you know, Parable of the Sower. Let's see, in terms of my own practice or philosophy, you know, I share too that I enjoy teaching. I hope to be a lifelong educator as well. And also I like what happens in the class, because I think it is the classroom, it's an opportunity for everyone to learn, right? There's learning that happens and we all experience that. And so, and there's something to that. There's a magic that happens in the classroom. And when you're an educator and you work in academic settings, you get to experience that over, you know, we graduated, but we get to experience that every semester. Yeah. And so I hope to always create an environment in a classroom setting, whatever mode it is, where you know, I get to experience that with students, and that I'm learning, they're learning, we're learning from each other in a sense. And, you know, yeah.
Perfect. Well said. Dr. Coleman, how about you? Who do you identify with, and how do you situate your life work and liken it to Lauren's life work?
Thanks for that question. First, I want to say, Dr. Sarton, that was beautiful. And I don't know what to say after that. Magic of the classroom, for real. Like yeah, it is a magical thing. And I think I identify with Anyanwu. Like I mentioned, I dream that, but like you were saying, I do see myself in various characters. I even see myself in Doro. Like sometimes the pain of disconnection from the thing that you hope for, from like a life of people who don't necessarily understand you within a larger world, especially as a Black person, that has systems that are set up to not understand you on purpose, and then trying to work and navigate that. But also Anyanwu's connection to her body and to adaptivity and to wanting to build communities wherever she is. I think that one of the most important things for me is that Anyanwu is a healer.
Yeah.
Even if it takes pain that kind of hurts her own body. In order for her to heal, she has to go through the things that people have gone through in order to give them any poultice or any type of solution or forms of care. She has to be able to feel it in herself. And I think that that's part of what has gotten me to get into the classroom space, right? Having the impulse to be open, to understand that sometimes the things that I feel other people are feeling, that it's going to be difficult to work through. But I think that it is for a larger purpose. It is for something that is life work for me. And I think, and I've shared this with students before, that part of the reason why I'm in the classroom is because the classrooms that I've been in the past didn't necessarily reflect the classroom that I needed. And I think that in order to create classrooms that we need, we have to be open, as we were saying earlier, we have to be vulnerable, and we have to understand that it isn't always going to be neat and tidy, right? And it isn't always going to be one thing or one presentation of that thing, just like Anyanwu isn't always going to be her one representation of herself and her body too. She contains multitudes, classrooms contain multitudes. And like you said, Dr. Sarton, I would love to be a lifelong educator because it forces me to be a lifelong learner. And I think that that's an important thing.
And if I could offer my input, for me, I identify with Baba Olamina. I think he's our contemporary, right? Like he's living in our now. And then also for me, my daughter. My daughter is so much Lauren. It's hard for me to even see myself as Lauren, because I'm living with Lauren every day. Even the how Lauren talks about she likes to eavesdrop and kind of get info. That's my daughter. She might be at the door right now listening, probably just because that's just how she is. So I definitely identify with Baba Olamina. He's an educator, right? He's a spiritual guide. Myself, within my own spiritual journey, I'm kind of learning and going down African spiritual traditions to situate myself as a priest. So I really identify with him in a great way. And then for my life work, I agree with y'all, right? It's being in these spaces, being in front of students, and more importantly, right, inspiring them to know what their life work is. And for me, that's the work right there, to get them to understand that, yeah, you could get an education for a job, but what is that really, right? And how more profoundly impactful is it to leave a classroom space with an experience? And I heard you mention that earlier, Dr. Sarton, like, you seek to engage in your students with an experience. And to me, that's the work that we need to be at. Also, kind of to circle back to what you were mentioning, Dr. Coleman, in regards to Anyanwu being a healer, right? As educators, we're healers. If you think back to the ancient African traditions, education and healing was inseparable. It was one and the same thing. You think about, Imhotep, right? The world's first multi-genius was not only he was a priest, a sage, an intellectual, he was a healer. He was a doctor, right? So this goes, one, it's the most, to be an educator, in my opinion, is one of the most humbling and profoundly impactful experiences that you could have. And I think oftentimes it's taken for granted. And you talk about, low pay and things like that. And all those conversations, to me, somewhat devalues what we're here for. Don't get me wrong, I want my check. I'm not saying that, right? but most importantly, right, like I think we have a higher calling at play when we step into these positions and step into these roles. And we have an opportunity not only to educate our students, but more importantly, heal our students, which will allow them to go out and heal the world. And it makes me think of Pop, really, because one of my favorite quotes is like, I might not be the one who changes the world, but I guarantee you I will spark the mind that will change the world. And that's the potential that we have as educators every time we engage students.